but we've got Marc Newlin, who is with us remotely. He is going to talk about why does my battery have Bluetooth. I have one of these batteries, and I feel much safer with his talk being remote. So, Marc, if you can hear me, you are ready to go.
Well, thank you, everybody, for joining today. I'm bummed that I'm not there to be in person and join for all of the shenanigans and all the fun you're all having. But we had a bit of a snafu with our travel, so we slept in and missed our flight on Friday morning, and then our return flight was canceled preemptively by the airline, so we decided to screw it and stay home and not try to make the trip to DC. So I'm missing the snowball competitions and the snowman building and all that, but I'm not feeling terrible about not having to try to fly out of DC this Sunday. So I hope you all have successful luck getting home and wherever your travels take you today. Also just want to share a brief anecdote about how my day went yesterday for the context. I woke up by taking a spill in the bathroom and hitting my head on the bathroom tub, and ended up needing 10 staples in the back right of my head. And so I was spending yesterday dealing with that. So my headspace is a little bit wonky today. So please bear with me, and thank you for the last minute schedule changing. So this talk is titled, Why Does My Battery Have Bluetooth? And that question is really the genesis of the talk. Before we get in, just a quick background on who I am. My name is Marc Newlin. I work as a principal reverse engineer at SkySafe, where I get to spend my days doing RE work on drones, which is an absolute blast. In the past, I've been a frequent competitor in a handful of different DARPA competitions, and I have this feature where I will hack anything with a radio. And it's been a while since I've done any public-facing IoT hackery. And so when the chance to play with this battery came along, it was hard for me to pass up. And so we'll start with a little bit of backstory on why it is that I have one of these batteries, why I decided to investigate it. Then we'll talk a bit about the bugs and the targets. I started looking at one battery and ended up getting another one, and I have suspicions that the bugs affect even more models than just these. Then we'll look at some of the reverse engineering process and methodology. We'll look at the disclosure process and how remediation went with Anchor. And then share a few comments on where we might go from here and take any questions from the audience. So this project started back in 2024. We were going up to see my parents in Seattle for Thanksgiving, and my wife went up before me, and she had her Anchor battery with her, and she often takes it when she's out and about or traveling or whatnot. And I was still at home down here in Los Angeles, and I got a text message from my wife asking why her battery had Bluetooth. And so I thought about this for a couple minutes, and I figured, probably something to do with gathering telemetry on the batteries, but I wasn't really sure. I hadn't actually looked too closely at the battery when I bought it for her. I just saw that it was a well-reviewed product from a company that I have had good experiences with in the past. And I got off that text message thread and thought about it for a minute, and I realized that this could actually be an interesting platform from a security research standpoint, because you have a thing with a lot of batteries, you have USB ports, you have a microcontroller, a little LCD display, or maybe an OLED display. I'm not sure what technology that is. And then you have, microcontroller, Bluetooth. So it has a lot of fun features that could be leveraged if you're able to do something like pushing custom firmware to the battery. So I went from trying to kindly answer my wife's question to a few hours later, I had ordered one of these batteries and decided to start hacking it myself. And when I was heading back home from this trip to Thanksgiving, I then was talking to a friend on the airplane, and he also bought one of these batteries and did a little bit of collaboration, but unfortunately his time allocation changed and we weren't able to go through the full project together. So the targets and the bugs. This first target is the Anker Prime Power Bank model A1340. And this is the one that my wife has that I've now purchased two of for myself to hack. First one I bricked, well, I didn't brick it, but I got it into a non-revertible state by updating the firmware after they had fixed the bug. So I got another one for demos for this talk. It's a pretty cool power bank from a consumer standpoint, a product standpoint. It works really well. It's an attractive looking device. You can charge multiple things at a high rate from it. And in general, batteries make me nervous, but it feels well built and well constructed, and so I felt okay about using one of these. Inside this A1340, there are a couple ICs which are of interest for RE purposes. There is the very bottom right of this image. There is a Telink BLE MCU, the TLSR 8253, or possibly the 8252. This is a company, Telink, that I hadn't worked with before, but they're fairly popular, it looks like, Bluetooth sock vendor. They don't use an ARM instruction set. They have their own ISA. And so this Telink BLE MCU, it has a serial interface to this Giga Devices ARM MCU, and this is the one with the QR code on it, just up from the Telink chip. And the Giga Devices ARM MCU is the primary application processor. And then this circuit board sits on a big old stack of lithium polymer pouches. And so within the battery case itself, you have the kind of plastic outside shell, and then there's an inner plastic compartment which holds the LiPo cells with maybe 0.5 centimeter of space in between. And because LiPo cells are full of energy and fire, I do my best not to open batteries if I can avoid it. And so starting the RE process on this, I was doing everything I could to avoid having to actually take apart the battery. So in addition to the two SoCs that I just mentioned, there's also an Android app, and this talks to the battery and also to the cloud API. And from what I've learned, the cloud API is this MQTT setup, which may be on AWS IoT. It might be using Anker's similarly worded backend services. They have their Anker web service acronym in some of their firmware, but they also use S3. So I'm a little bit fuzzy on exactly what their backend stack looks like. But the purpose of the phone app is basically to work as a bridge between communications and log messages and telemetry on the battery and whatever their backend is. And so the phone app takes log messages and telemetry from the battery, stores it on the phone app for a minute, and then pushes it up to the cloud. And the Bluetooth sock is responsible for doing a similar message proxy, except it proxies messages from the ARM MCU to the BLE sock and then to the phone, which then goes to the cloud. The ARM MCU, this controls the little display on the battery, talks to the USB power delivery controllers, and is used for performing firmware updates on itself and the BLE sock. And we'll get into the firmware update process in a bit, but the kind of precarious nature of it is that in order to update the firmware on the Bluetooth sock, the firmware image starts in the cloud, goes from the cloud to the phone app, from the phone app over the air to the BLE sock, from the BLE sock over a serial interface to the ARM MCU. The ARM MCU then caches the BLE firmware and then pushes it back to the ARM MCU over a serial interface. And so there are a lot of moving parts to making any of these updates actually functional. The second target is this Solix C200D battery. Solix is Anker's line of solar charging batteries. And it took me a while to get one of these, to get any Solix battery, primarily because they're really expensive, and I didn't want to spend thousands of dollars on a giant solar battery just for the laughs. But it turns out they have this relatively small and inexpensive one called the C200D. This has a LIFE SO4, I think is the acronym for the battery chemistry cells. And so they're not lipo cells, apparently not as volatile, but I also was doing my best not to open this one. I didn't want to cause any battery fires if I could avoid it. And so the Solix batteries, they're designed for doing capture and storage of solar energy. So this particular one is shown in the marketing literature is used if you are camping or that sort of thing. This is a little bit different than the Anchor Prime battery in that instead of having this GigaDevices ARM MCU and the Telink BLE sock, this uses an Espressif ESP32 and implements both Bluetooth and Wi-Fi. And so the Bluetooth interface is a replacement for the Telink SoC on the Anchor Prime power bank and serves that same function of proxy devices between the battery through the phone to the back end. But the Solix batteries also have a Wi-Fi radio, and they use this to connect to the internet. And so this is a more direct telemetry connection than having a proxy between a phone. There are some other MCUs on the A1727, and I haven't attempted to look at them. It looks like there's a separate microcontroller which is used for controlling the display, as well as another handful of chips that I haven't characterized. And I didn't attempt to fully disassemble the A1727 battery. And so because of that, I don't actually know what everything is that's inside there. But if we look at the bottom of this picture here, so the shielded device in the bottom right is the ESP32 sock. And just below that, we see these 6 through-hole solder points, and these are filled in this image. But when you get the new A1727 battery delivered to you, they're just unpopulated through-holes. And on the other side of this board, which you can see if you shine a flashlight carefully into the side of the battery, it actually is silk screened, and it is a debug header for the ESP32 sock. And so I saw this, and my first thinking was, okay, that's great that they left the debug headers on, but certainly they haven't actually left the debug functionality on. But of course, vendors being vendors, they have, and so it's possible to read the flash memory from the ESP32 using that debug header. And so in the case of my battery, I was able to do that without actually fully disassembling the battery, and instead just sort of taking off a chunk of the plastic in front of where those debug headers are and soldering onto them. And so between these two batteries, there were a variety of bugs, but it was kind of a weird disclosure because I'm used to relatively specific things I'm complaining about to a vendor. And in this case, the general problem was, they forgot to do security, at least on the firmware, hardware, wireless side. So the firmware updates are all unencrypted, and as of the time of this research, they were all unsigned. There also was no authentication over BLE on the batteries. And so they basically treat the BLE interface on the battery as a kind of like a USB port in terms of authentication, but that you can access wirelessly. And so anybody can connect to the BLE interface on the battery anytime that it's powered on, as long as the battery is not already connected to the user's phone. And so this means there's no barrier to connecting to the device wirelessly. The firmware images are all served from unsigned AWS S3 links, and they're, again, unencrypted. After the talk, I will push an update to the GitHub repo for this work with some additional S3 URLs and firmware images that I've collected. There is incredibly verbose logging in the Android app. This is almost makes me feel like I should say that this work isn't really reverse engineering, but taking documentation in the form of the Android app logs and implementing a Python script based on that API that was described. And so when you add all this up, what you get are the makings of a nice drive-by firmware update attack. So the the Android app is kind of a gem in that they have full logging of things like key exchanges and all of the specific keys that get used in the process. I wanted more of a challenge, but also I really enjoyed the fact that it's so easy in this case. So when we're doing the reverse engineering, we have a bunch of targets. We have multiple embedded targets, the Bluetooth and Giga devices, SoCs on the Prime power bank, the ESP32 on the Solix power bank, and then the Android app on both. The Android app, it's the same Android app for both batteries. And based on some strings in the Android app, it looks like it supports a considerably larger number of batteries. I have not gone out and purchased every Anker or Solix battery to test. And so I'm hoping that with the POC code being out there, that people can determine if these bugs are in fact present on other Anker products. One thing to note during the disclosure process, I asked Anker for a list of affected devices. And their response was to tell me that they could not provide it because it would affect the security of their customers and it would affect unreleased devices. So that tells me that they probably have other deployed devices that have these same bugs and that they probably have the same protocols baked into new batteries, because that's what you do if you're a company that makes a thing and you have a communication protocol for it. So the Android app is built using the Flutter framework. And I haven't worked with Flutter before, but it's a cross-platform UI framework. It has a language called Dash, which is a JavaScript, C-ish sort of language. And Flutter does this thing where when you build a Flutter app, it is built in a way where it is hard coupled to the specific version of the Flutter compiler or interpreter or JIT or whatever the deal is. And so to reverse it, you have to have a same, or at least to use any of the RE tools for Flutter, you generally have to have a copy of the identical version that was used to build the original app, and it can be kind of a tedious process. They've also implemented certificate pinning, which makes it difficult to intercept cloud and API man-in-the-middle requests. So you can, for instance, not just do a simple web proxy between the app and the internet to identify the messages that are sent back and forth. They also have a white box crypto library baked into the app. I'm not entirely sure why or where this is used. It doesn't appear to be used for like whole app obfuscation or whole binary obfuscation, but they do have some small binary blobs which appear to be protected by this, and so it's kind of unclear what the function was there. But from seeing this, it made it clear that Anker at least made an attempt to do some things to make it hard to reverse engineer their Android app. And this to me is usually a good sign that a vendor cares about security, but when it's already been apparent that they don't have signatures on their firmware updates and that they don't have authentication on the Bluetooth link, you start to wonder, is this the appearance of security or actual security? And again, so the basic function of the Android app is telemetry and firmware updates. There's not a lot you can do with it. You can view your batteries over Bluetooth. You can view some settings, some status of them. If firmware updates are available, you can push them. But that's really about it. And so it seems like because of the potential difficulties of doing RE on the Android app, it might not be worth spending a huge amount of time on it unless the other routes don't pan out. So I decided to start with the Telink BLE SoC. This is the SoC found on the Anker Prime Power Bank A1340. And one thing that I can't stop thinking during this project is that Telink is it's basically a Chinese Nordic in that they have a similar type of product set. They have very good documentation and SDK support. And I would sort of call Telink the, Chinese Nordic with a RISC-based ISA instead of an ARM ISA like Nordic uses. Conveniently, somebody has already implemented a Ghidra processor implementation for this telling TC32 instruction set. And so I was able to use that to trivially load the telling firmware image into Ghidra and get some possible pseudocode out with lots of debug strings. And so, without a lot of work, I was able to get a lot of application level and protocol information out of this firmware image. And so one thing we can do with BLE communications, if we have an Android device, is to use the BT Snoop mechanism that Android has. And this is a way to record BLE communications between an Android app and the device it's communicating with. And what's nice about this BT Snoop method is that you can intercept and record these communications without needing a rooted phone. So it's possible to keep a phone as close to a production normal phone as you can get, and do normal things with the app, and then recover the Bluetooth comms, and then use that to kind of piece together what the protocol was doing. And one question I like to answer when looking at these sort of communications is, how do we actually get the firmware for the device? When we're performing a firmware update, are we downloading some encrypted blob that's then getting sent in that encrypted format to the phone? Is it being downloaded from somewhere that requires authentication? Is it somehow a build that's specific to our device? And a lot of those questions can be answered, I find, by looking at what actually happens when you're running a firmware update, what happens on the side of the phone, what happens on the side of the BLE sock, and so forth. Then we have the Giga devices, GD32 ARM MCU. The GD32 series are basically clones of the STM32 MCUs. And so it's a familiar ARM ISA and STM32 peripheral set. And again, this talks to the BLE sock over a serial link. It appears to also talk to another microcontroller related to the display on the battery, but I haven't characterized that microcontroller. And so, cursory assessment of the Giga devices MCU. It looks like it has a lot of the same functions implemented as the Telink sock. So it looks like they have a common code base that exists in, probably a C code base somewhere, that they compile targeting the Telink ISA, targeting the ARM ISA for this MCU, and also targeting the Extensa ISA for the Espressif SoC. And the MCU does support readout protection, so it's possible that they've prevented hardware flash dumping attacks, or at least low complexity ones. And we have the Espressif ESP32. This is only found on the Solix batteries. And again, this is the main application sock on the A1727. They have I believe 4 megabytes of flash on this ESP chip, and it's mostly occupied with data, and so it looks like a pretty large application. It's kind of a neat device because you have a microcontroller and Bluetooth and Wi-Fi in one package. And for the marketing material for the Solix battery, it sounds like the battery connects to the internet over Wi-Fi and then sends telemetry to the cloud back in that way. And I believe this is just an alternate to the Bluetooth and phone app telemetry channel. What I haven't tried to figure out is, what Anchor does with all of the telemetry they collect, if this is just, monitoring safety metrics for their products and making sure they're not experiencing thermal events in the wild, or if they are actually, offering some sort of remote command and control mechanism. I haven't looked at how they market their products to their enterprise customers. And so the very first pass of doing RE was intercepting the BLE comms between the battery and the Android app, and then performing a firmware update, or otherwise operating the battery, and then going back and looking at the recovered messages, whether that's log messages on the phone or Bluetooth messages recorded from the BT Snoop mechanism, And then the hope is that we can take these log messages and other communications and kind of reconstruct an idea of what the protocol looks like. And so it turns out that the protocol is a very simple nested TLV-based protocol. It looks pretty much the same as any other serial protocol that you'll see on embedded devices, especially the types of devices that have a addressing mechanism where you're trying to address messages to go between different microcontrollers on a board or different devices over a wireless interface. Some of the payloads that were sent over BLE looked very low entropy, and then some of them had segments which looked very high entropy. And the low entropy payloads were all at the start of the communication exchange, and the high entropy payloads came later. There's also no sign of Bluetooth authentication. And so my assumption was that they were probably doing a unauthenticated connection between the phone and the battery, and then having no application layer authentication or encryption initially, and then doing some kind of a key exchange, and then encrypting payloads at the application layer once they've done this key exchange. And this is kind of a general model I've seen a lot of vendors use. And it always makes me excited because when somebody has implemented a custom authentication or encryption or any kind of a protocol in general, I think the fewer eyeballs that get to review something and get to look at it, the higher the chances of something being broken or something being overlooked. So I kind of like these custom protocols. And with the Bluetooth logs, I could see kind of a high-level structure of the exchange and response, request and response exchanges between the two devices. But you're still looking at just bytes, and there's no introspection yet as to what those bytes represent. And so I look next at the Flutter app logs on the Android app. To access these, you have to have a rooted Android phone. This is because the Flutter logs are in the protected data directory for the app, and so you can't recover them with the bug report mechanism that I was able to find out. So with the exception, though, that you need a rooted phone, you can otherwise just install and run the Anchor app on a rooted Android phone and find this app_log.log file, and it is filled with this just amazing level of verbosity. So this is kind of small text on this slide, but this is just showing a handful of API requests. So these are requests between the phone and their backend API. And we see we have logs including messages of key material and specific plain text payloads that are sent. And this ended up providing a fairly good explainer on how Anchor views communications between their cloud and the phone and the devices. And it looks like all of the telemetry implementation they have is based around getting as much data from as many of their deployed devices as possible into their backend. And from a business standpoint, that makes perfect sense. If you have deployed a ton of batteries out in the world, it's important to know, are they operating in a safe way? Because when batteries catch on fire, nothing good happens for anybody. And so I understand the need to have a lot of logging, but it's just kind of entertaining to me to see that they just crank the verbosity knob all the way to the top. And they also have very verbose logs of the BLE API requests and responses. And in this case, they have a lot of comments that are written in Chinese, which I don't speak, but I found that just opening the log files, the log text files in Chrome and translating worked quite well to get the English messages back out. Here we have some identifiers which are getting logged in the top few messages. This is giving us the device serial number and its Bluetooth MAC, and then the AES key, which is derived from the serial number, the Bluetooth MAC. Then we have another instance of another AES key later on in the exchange shown down there. We have a encrypted payload next to its decrypted equivalent. And this is the pattern that Anchor follows a lot in their application logs, where if they are doing an exchange between the phone and the battery, they will log the plain text message that the phone is going to send. They will log the encryption key. They will log the encrypted message that's going to get sent. They will log the encrypted response bytes, and then they will log the decrypted response payloads. And then in some cases, they will annotate the payloads and provide names for the different parameters which are parsed out. And so there's almost enough information in the app logs to fully reconstruct their API. But the constraint is they don't show the full contents of all messages, and some messages they only show the first 20 bytes of. And some messages don't have the parameter annotations. But in general, you can get a complete understanding of the protocol and its encoding mechanisms just by reading the app logs. And as simple as taking one of these AES keys that is displayed in the logs and immediately validating it by writing a simple Python script that uses that key to decode one of the payloads printed just above it. And so it was very quick to determine that they are in fact logging the actual keys that they are using for encrypting this Bluetooth communication channel. And this provided a large picture of what was going on, but not a complete picture. One thing that's been missing is what the actual firmware is, what it actually looks like. And so I took one of the A1430 batteries and performed a firmware update on it. And so the battery at the time, it had a firmware version 1.2.4, I believe. And then it was able to do an update to 1.5.3. And so I found when I ran the DFU process, I was doing this primarily to collect all of the BLE messages that went over the link during the update. But I found that they actually list the AWS3 URLs of the firmware images on the API responses from their cloud backend. And these S3 URLs are not signed. They're not time limited. And so you can grab those and just copy and paste them into a web browser and download their update images. I haven't found a general way to enumerate the firmware update images, but as long as you have a battery that needs an update, it's possible to get the URLs of the updates that it's going to use before you actually try and do the update and change your battery in some way. So the protocol came together sort of from a bunch of different angles. Started with looking at the BT Snoop logs and the app logs while performing a firmware update, trying to figure out how the DFU protocol works, and then iterating on that by doing some more binary reversing of the firmware update images. And eventually I was able to piece together enough of the protocol to be able to perform key exchanges with both of the Anchor A1340 and A1727 batteries, and then push firmware images, unmodified firmware images initially, to the batteries. And at this point, it seemed like, okay, I can have this mechanism where I can send Anchor's firmware to Anchor's battery, and I can talk to the battery and do this key exchange. And all I can see from a integrity protection standpoint on the firmware images is a CRC, or maybe an MD5, but I think just a CRC. And there weren't any cryptographically secure checks on the integrity of the firmware images. And so to me, that feels like something where you can potentially modify a firmware image and send malicious firmware to one of these batteries. And so just to do a quick recap of what we know now of the protocol, you have the app-to-cloud communications, which are done over MQTT. They're done with encrypted payloads using key material that's established during a key exchange between the app and the cloud. You have then the app-to-telnet communications, where you have this no authentication and then a simple but kind of pointless key exchange over BLE. And when I say pointless, during the normal flow, the Cloud API vends a user identifier, which is used as a seed for generating the AES key. That user identifier goes to the phone sends that to the battery. And my initial expectation was that this was going to be some kind of a pre-shared key or something where the key was generated based off of an identifier on the battery or something to tightly couple this key to this battery. But it turns out that you can just connect to the battery and send any key and it will accept it. And so there's really no authentication whatsoever that the battery does to confirm that the Bluetooth client connecting to it is allowed to connect to it. And then we have the Telink and ARM serial comms. So these are the communications over the serial link between the Telink and ARM chip on the board. And again, for doing a firmware update, the Bluetooth messages first go to the Telink chip. It sends everything to the ARM chip. The ARM chip does the CRC32 or whatever other integrity verification, updates its own firmware, and then pushes the Telink firmware back over to the Telink SoC. And the DFU commands are mostly handled by the ARM MCU. There's kind of a bit of a gray area because you have the initial connection setup, which happens explicitly with the Telink MCU, but mostly during the firmware update, the Telink MCU is functioning as a proxy between the phone and the ARM MCU. And so using the information that I was able to piece together from these sources, I was able to cobble together a DFU client where I initially didn't have the key exchange. And for the first POC, I just used a key which I pulled directly out of the logs and used that to encrypt messages over BLE and send a firmware update. And then I iterated on that and figured out how the key exchange worked. And so now there's a POC which will perform the key exchange against a battery which has not been seen before, and then push the Telink and Giga devices update image over to that battery. And so the Telink MCU was a really interesting one from an RE standpoint because of the extremely verbose debug logging. And the Telink MCU, it implements a subset of the commands that were observed in the BLE logs, but not all of them. And so I wasn't sure if this was only a case of me only seeing logging for some functions and just missing other functions because I was being lazy and only looking for debug strings. Or maybe the ARM MCU handles some of the functions and the Telink MCU only handles others. And so it turned out that that was the case where there's this division of labor where based on the specific command that gets sent, it will either be handled by the Telink MCU or dispatched to the ARM MCU. And it looks like they have this similar sort of dispatch and RPC mechanism across their protocols on their different hardware platforms. And the Giga devices MCU, this is very, very verbose like the Telink MCU. It provides even more context on the data not in the Android app logs, filling in corner cases on data structures and message types. And, there are being a kind of imperfect firmware code. There are cases where, message handlers are just null functions at the end. And so there are a lot of messages to find where it's unclear if they might be used in other batteries or other versions of the protocol and not these. So it took some weeding through all of the uninteresting bits to find the interesting bits. But with this, it was possible to really understand the full flow of the update between the different components. And then the ESP32. This one is a very goofy microcontroller in this usage. ESP32 can be very easily configured to have readout protection so that you don't have to worry about somebody dumping your flash memory from a UART interface or something. Unfortunately for Anchor, they did not turn on any readout protection mechanisms on the ESP32 or the Giga devices MCU. But in the ESP32 case, if we remember that picture where we have the SoC and the debug pins next to it, I was able to just solder some wires onto those debug pins without having to really fully take the battery out of the case, and then just used a standard off-the-shelf UART interface and was able to use a standard FTD or ESP32 tooling to dump the flash memory off of the ESP32 on this A1727 battery. Unfortunately, when I was doing the reverse engineering on this, there weren't any firmware updates available for the A1727. And so I was able to see the firmware as is, but I didn't have the opportunity to observe the firmware update process until I got the actual patched firmware from Anchor. So at this point, I have the information that I believe I need in order to push a modified firmware image to one or both batteries. But I don't have a way to unfuck it if I brick something. I've been talking about the complexity of or fragility, I guess, of the firmware update process, where you go from, cloud to app to phone to BLE sock to ARM sock back to BLE sock. That's a lot of hops to update the firmware on the BLE sock. A lot of places for things to go wrong. And so what I wanted to do was figure out how I could modify the default Anchor firmware images without, risking bricking the battery and having to buy another one, because these things are expensive. And so for the BLE sock, I thought the easiest change would be changing the name of the BLE display device from Anchor Prime Power Bank to Anchor LOLOL Power Bank. So that would be just basically a string find and replace in the firmware. And assuming that I was correct that there was no signature on there, then it would just be change the string, update the CRC, and send it to the battery. For the ARM MCU, it wasn't as clear what to do, because there's some code that I had awareness of was related to the communication protocol, but I was really hesitant to make any changes to those communication protocol mechanisms, because I didn't want to do something that would prevent the battery from being able to communicate with me. I didn't want to start a DFU and then have it stop responding and not know why, because I screwed up something with the serial comms between the ARM and BLE chips. But I got thinking about the display on the battery, and it has both some letters and numbers which are displayed, as well as a little animation that is displayed during the firmware update process. And so I figured, maybe they have some sort of a text engine, and they have like ASCII text in the firmware somewhere that they're rendering to the display. And so I took a look through the GD32 firmware. I didn't see any obvious strings that matched anything I saw in the display on the battery. But then I was thinking that, okay, so maybe if they're not using, texts that turn ASCII characters into rendered font glyphs, maybe they're using one of these like embedded bitmap fonts. And I've played with these a bit before with some LED projects where I've had bitmap glyphs for individual letters and numbers and characters embedded basically in a byte array in firmware, and then I would load those at runtime and map them to specific LEDs. And I have no idea if that's a normal way to do that type of display, but I thought it could be how Anchor was doing it. And so I went down this rabbit hole of trying to figure out how to find images which are embedded, like graphical images which are embedded in a binary file. And like tools like Binwalk were super helpful, because they were using weird encodings and embedding things as just byte arrays, which are hard to identify as images. And so I spent some time just scrolling through the hex display of the ARM firmware in Ghidra, and just kind of looking for anything that stood out to me as a pattern, or maybe something that looked like it could be a repeating structure. And eventually I found a few cases of a smallest chunk of data that kind of looked the same, like it might be, multiple data structures getting written to Flash. And, kept looking around with these and found a case where there was a data structure of two unsigned 16-bit integers, which I inferred to be width and height. And following that was width times height, number of bytes times 2. And so what that meant is it looked like they were doing some kind of a simple width and height encoding with 2 bytes per pixel, somehow encoding the data that way. And I used this pattern to then find other cases in the firmware where they had, these blocks of data which look like they might be images or bitmaps of some kind. And so I wrote a script to basically take all of these potential images, dump them to disk, and then I could look through and see, like, do any of these look like images? If they do, does it look like there's any letters or numbers in there? And through some trial and error, I was able to identify a number of contiguous regions of memory in the ARM code where I could extract things that looked kind of like letters or kind of like numbers. And so I then tried patching the firmware by taking some of these sequences of letters and numbers and horizontally reversing the 16-bit pixels in those data structures. And my thinking was that this would be a way where I could change something that I could visually see on the battery, but without changing any logic that could potentially brick it in a way that's not apparent. And so fortunately that worked out. And it was possible to horizontally reverse at least one of the numerical sets of fonts on the GD32. Unfortunately, there were a bunch of cases where I found fonts which I thought matched exactly the fonts I saw used on the display, but in practice, I would horizontally flip them and see nothing change. And so there's a lot that I don't understand about their font usage, but this was at least a way to demonstrate that you could modify the firmware on both MCUs and then send it to the device and see a change that you can see visually on the LCD display or through the another device by looking at the Anchor BLE display name on the left there. And so with those bugs together in that POC, we then demonstrated that we can modify firmware for multiple microcontrollers on this Anchor Prime power bank, and then send our modified firmware with an unauthenticated BLE connection to the battery and force our firmware onto a given target's battery. The only requirement for the attack to work is that the target battery must have Bluetooth enabled. The target battery must not be actively connected to the phone that is paired with. But as long as the phone it's paired with is not in Bluetooth range, then an attacker can connect to the battery and push this modified firmware to it. And, I don't have a good sense for what the blast radius is if you have custom firmware running on one of these batteries. But there were a number of thoughts I had that I wanted to explore, but I didn't feel safe doing so. And so questions like, can you trigger a thermal event from modified firmware on a battery? Or, is it possible to use the Bluetooth interface on these batteries to create some kind of self-propagating malware that would spread to other batteries? And the kind of last question that came into my mind was, has anybody made a botnet of battery fires? And just to be clear, it would be a terrible idea to do so, but from a purely technical standpoint, it sort of feels like it would be feasible to do that. And I'm really curious to see, to learn if anybody has done that, and if so, if I'll ever get to know about it, because it seems like a fun technical problem to work on, minus the, botnet that makes fire aspect. And so when I started this project, I was not expecting a positive outcome. I've been, I don't want to say jaded, but at this point, I expect vendors to not do all of the right things. And Anchor did a lot more of the right things than I was expecting. During our disclosure exchanges, I made some recommendations to them. I recommended that they added a signature to their update images, also that they encrypt their update images, but at a minimum, having a signature would be good. I recommend that they use some sort of a PKI-based authenticated protocol for connecting to the battery over BLE. And I told them that it would have been a lot harder to reverse the BLE protocol without the verbose logging in the Telink sock and without the verbose logging in the Android app. So they did remove the verbose logging from the Telink sock. The patched firmware for the Telink sock that they released, it does have additional logging about the new encryption scheme they've added, but they've removed the logging about the old encryption scheme, so I guess that's progress. But they also did not remove the verbose logging from the Android app, did not remove it from the GD32 microcontroller or the ESP32. So while Anchor has made some progress in this case, and it's very good response, all things considered, but they still have a ways to go. And this also means there are still lots of fun things for people to grab and reverse without a lot of work to continue fleshing out our knowledge of this ecosystem. So now I'm going to do a demo of the key exchange process with this Anchor A1340 battery. I was going to do a firmware update demo, but this is a battery that I just purchased, and it is running firmware which is behaving differently than the same firmware on an old battery, and I'm still trying to figure out why my original DFU POC is failing on this. But we can at least take a look at the pairing process. Okay. So as you can see, I am a relatively new user of Apple computers as a daily driver, personal machine, and I'm still trying to figure out all of the Appleisms. So what I'm going to run here is this script targeting the Bluetooth MAC address of this battery here, and we'll look at it as it takes the battery through the key exchange and establishes the session key, which is then used to encrypt all of the remaining traffic. So in this case, the DFU update part of the process has failed because they've changed the protocol. This version of this battery firmware, I need to recharacterize it. But we can scroll up here and see the session key, for instance, that was generated by the battery and returned to the phone. And we can look at these logs. This is going through and showing us all the parameters of the key exchange for the battery. And all of the POC code, a bunch of notes, example logs, firmware images are up in the GitHub repository. Let me put a link for that back up here. And with that, I am happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Mark. We don't actually have time for questions, unfortunately, but we will connect people with you offline.
Yep, sounds good. Hope you all have a great rest of the conference.